We are blessed to be here today to study God's Word, to understand His will for His people. There are some subjects in the Bible that are more delicate and difficult to deal with than others. And today's subject might be considered by some people one of those topics. But it's actually the first of a series I'm going to be preaching on Babylon. Babylon. And it's sort of subtitled Coming Out ? Babylon Coming Out ? I received a letter this week from a concerned brother that while a lot of my teachings and publications had been a blessing and a help, that there was also a great concern that I was overstepping in my understanding regarding Babylon. And as I read the letter, I came to realize that this brother really didn't understand my position, or more properly, the real biblical position on Babylon. And I fear that maybe other people have similar misunderstandings or would like to understand this topic in a deeper way. And so I'm preparing a series on Babylon that I hope will help us. Today is going to be really just some basics about Babylon and what the Bible says about it. What is the concept of Babylon? Now, if you get your concordance out, as best I could find, there are about 294 references to the term Babylon in the Bible, and that's found in 260 verses. We certainly don't have the exhaustive time to go through all those verses in this series. But there's 249 of those verses in the Old Testament and 11 verses in the New Testament. And of those 11 verses in the New Testament, there are 7 that are of particular interest to us, which we shall look at each of those 7 today. The first 4 of those references refer to the Babylon of what we call the Old Testament or ancient Babylon, the city, the nation of Babylon, whereas the last 7 of these references in the New Testament clearly refer to a different type of Babylon. Now, the first place in the Scriptures that Babylon is mentioned is in the book of Genesis. And there it's mentioned under the name of Babel. In Genesis chapter 10, verse 10, speaking of Nimrod, it says, "And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar." The land of Shinar. In Genesis chapter 11 and verse 9, we read also about Babel. And these are the 2 places where you find the term Babel in the Scriptures. It says, "Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth." Babel was a place of rebellion against the God of heaven. And it was a demonstration of unbelief in the promise that God would never flood the earth again. Remember that. Remember that. It was a place of rebellion, and it was a place of unbelief. Now, the term Babel and the term Babylon are simply different translations of the same Hebrew word, Bavel. And it means in the Hebrew, confusion. It is from another word, Bela, which means to overflow. It's like overflow. Remember that Hebrew is a concrete language. It uses concrete things to express abstract concepts. The Hebrew language doesn't express abstract concepts like we do. We have special words that do that. If they were talking about anger, you would be talking about a hot nose. They didn't have a word for anger. They'd say his nose was hot. They'd use something very concrete. So here's the idea, something that's overflowing, just more than you can handle. Someone mentioned to me recently, they said, "Do you remember the old Lucille Ball episode where Lucy and Ethel were at the candy factory?" And if you've ever seen that episode in times past, you remember the stuff just kept coming so fast they couldn't keep up with it. They were overflowing, and it became confusion. Interestingly, though, Babylon's name to the early people that lived there was the Gate of God. They called it the Gate of God. And it was considered the route to heaven, they said. Even today, the leaders of this mystical Babylon claim that Babylon is the gate to God. But Babylon, friends, is no more the gate to God today than ancient Babylon was in ancient times. Remember that inspiration calls it confusion. Remember that. The ancient city of Babylon was on the eastern bank of the Euphrates, about 20 miles south of what we today call Baghdad, near the modern village of Hala in Iraq. Babylon would expand to become more than just a city. It became a nation by the same name. And this city and or nation would be mentioned a lot by various Bible writers, for instance, the writers of 2 Chronicles, 2 Kings, Ezra, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, as well as other biblical writers. Now again, the Bible speaks about really two Babylons, not simply the ancient city of the Old Testament that we read about. That's mentioned 4 times in the New Testament. That ancient city in the literal country of what we today call Iraq. But there's also a mystical Babylon, a spiritual city that is symbolic of something. And that is really the focus that we as Christians need to be understanding today. But to understand it fully, we need to understand a little bit about ancient Babylon. That will help us. And so let us look back at ancient Babylon a little bit. And again, Babylon's beginnings are given in the book of Genesis. We read part of this earlier, but let's just go back and reread a little bit in Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 10. It says, "And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel." Babel. Nimrod was someone who was opposed to God. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Nimrod was the first person to accept the title of king. And by this very act, he displayed a rebellion and defiance to God, who was the true king. Other rulers prior to Nimrod simply claimed to be a viceroy, one who stands in the place of the king. God was acknowledged as the king, and it was too close to the time of the flood to deny God. But instead, Nimrod claimed to be king. Now, remember that Babylon is founded upon 2 principles for 2 reasons. Firstly, in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 4. Genesis 11, verse 4. "And they said," the people said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into the heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So they're going to build this tower. It's going to reach up to the heavens. Now, when Noah's flood came, it reached over the highest mountains. But they figured, if we get up high enough, it didn't get into the heavens, we can build this tower, we can be safe. In Patriarchs and Prophets, on page 119, it says, "The dwellers on the plain of Shinar disbelieved God's covenant that he would not again bring a flood upon the earth." They disbelieved, didn't they? And that's why they're building this big tower, to make a place, a nation, a name for ourselves, and to escape another possible flood. So unbelief or lack of faith was the first reason for Babylon. Secondly, Babylon was founded because of rebellion against God. Again, in Genesis chapter 11 now, verses 2 through 4. "And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." Now friends, God had told Noah's descendants in Genesis chapter 9 verse 1 to replenish the earth. The earth. The whole earth. In other words, He wanted them to scatter and to disperse. And they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to stay right here. We're going to make a place and a name for ourselves right here, and we're going to stay together. We're not going to follow God's directive. And we don't believe God anyhow. So we're going to build this tower because He might send a flood again. In Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, on page 91, paragraph 2, it says, they built them a city and then conceived the idea of building a large tower to reach into the clouds, that they might dwell together in the city and tower and be no more scattered. They didn't want to be scattered. God said scatter. They didn't want to do it. That's rebellion, isn't it? God says to do something. If I don't do it, or I do the antithesis of it, is that not rebellion? Excuse me. So the two great principles of Babylon, the two things that supported Babylon were first an unbelief and secondly rebellion. And these same two issues are what gird up modern Babylon, mystical Babylon today. Babel was a project begun in defiance to God, and all that it stood for was in defiance to God. Even after God destroyed the Tower of Babel and confounded the languages of the people, causing many to scatter, the attractions of Babylon were still strong to the carnal mind, to those who did not have the glory and honor of God first and supreme. When Israel went to fight against Ai, they were repulsed. And the reason is given in Joshua chapter 7 and verse 1. But the children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed thing, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. Now what was that accursed thing he took?
Babylonian garment.
A Babylonish garment. In fact, he called it a goodly Babylonish garment. I don't know what he thought was good about it, but it appealed to the carnal mind. And it cost the lives of 36 good men. And you know, it's interesting in the way that God expresses this in Joshua 7 verse 1. But the children of Israel committed a trespass. But who actually did it? One person. Now, later on we find out his family is complicit in that they know he's done it. They know he's hid it. And so they must share his fate as well. But God holds His people accountable as a body for the sins of the individual. We should never, ever forget that. Now, Babylon later became the kingdom that we probably know best as the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. It was, no doubt, square foot for square foot, the most glorious to the eye city ever built. It was the place of the famous Hanging Gardens. But one night, the Medes and the Persians came knocking, and that basically was the end of Babylon. The city was step by step destroyed and has been uninhabited unto this day. Men through the ages have considered reestablishing Babylon, but God says it's not going to happen. Saddam Hussein had this big idea of a big building project, but we know what happened to Saddam Hussein. So, the Babylon that the New Testament speaks of in those 7 verses that we're going to look at cannot be the literal city of Babylon, but it's speaking about a symbolic and mystical, a spiritual city that is in opposition to God, that is in rebellion to God. It is a city of unbelief. And in fact, in the book of Revelation, there are 2 cities that are mentioned. There is the New Jerusalem and there is Babylon. And they stand in contradistinction one to the other. One is mystical Babylon and the other is the New Jerusalem. The first is mystical, symbolic, and operative only in the minds of the people. The second is real, literal, and comes from God. Now let's just talk a little bit more about ancient Babylon before we go on. concerning ancient Babylon. God used Babylon, and specifically King Nebuchadnezzar, as an instrument of chastisement. But there came a time when God said that Babylon had exceeded her authority and judgment was set against her. God instructed Isaiah to set a watchman. In Isaiah chapter 21, verses 6 through 8, he says, "For thus saith the Lord unto me, Go, set a watchman, let him declare what he seeth. And he saw a chariot with a couple of horsemen, a chariot of asses, and a chariot of camels. And he hearkened diligently with much heed. And he cried, A lion, my Lord. I stand continually upon the watchtower in the daytime, and I am set in my ward whole nights." But now notice verse 9. Notice verse 9. "And behold, there cometh a chariot of men with a couple of horsemen. And he answered and said, Babylon is fallen, and all the graven images of her gods he hath broken unto the ground." It says Babylon is what? Not just fallen. It is fallen. Remember that. God is repeating it to show its certainty, to show the emphasis. The two horsemen here represent the Medes and the Persians. And Babylon is said to be fallen, and all its images are broken down to the ground. Idolatry was everywhere in ancient Babylon, and of course, mystical Babylon will have its idols too. Jeremiah speaks about another quality of Babylon in Jeremiah chapter 51 and verses 7 through 9. Jeremiah 51 verses 7 through 9. It says, "Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her. Take balm for her pain. If so be she may be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her, and let us go, every one into his own country, for her judgment reacheth unto heaven, and is lifted up even to the skies." It says that she has a wine, and that all the nations have been made mad or crazy by her wine. It says, but her judgments have reached up unto heaven. Remember that. Remember that. Now, let's go to the New Testament, and we're going to begin looking at 7 verses with some surrounding contextual verses that speak about this mystic Babylon. And the first one's in 1 Peter 5:13, and it's sort of a borderline verse on this in a sense, and you'll see why. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13. Peter's writing, and he says here in closing, beginning the closing of his epistle, he says, "The church that is at Babylon, elect together with you, salute you, as so doth Marcus, my son." Now, again, there was no literal city of Babylon inhabited at this time. So Peter can't be speaking about a literal city. There's no evidence to support the idea that Peter ever labored in the area around literal Babylon. On the other hand, inspiration locates the closing labors, place of his labors, as well as his violent death, to be in Rome. In Acts of the Apostles on page 537, paragraph 1, it says, "In the providence of God, Peter was permitted to close his ministry in Rome, where his imprisonment was ordered by the Emperor Nero about the time of Paul's final arrest." Early Christians often used the cryptic title Babylon when speaking of the Roman capital. They did this to avoid the political reprisals from Nero and his persecutions that would come from this. Greetings were also sent, he says here, from Peter's son in the faith, Marcus. This is the one we call Mark or John Mark, who was a nephew to Barnabas. And according to Paul in Colossians 4:10, he places Mark in Rome on an earlier occasion. Consequently, most would agree that, that Peter is speaking about Rome when he uses the term Babylon. Remember that. We'll come back to that because that will tie back in a little bit later. Our next reference is Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8. And there followed another angel. There's following another angel because there's a first angel that's went ahead. In Revelation 14, 6 and 7, there's what we call the first angel's message. And we'll talk about that and tie this in a succeeding message to today's presentation. But it says there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Do you remember Isaiah chapter 21 verse 9? Babylon is fallen. You remember Jeremiah 51? She has this wine. See how it's tying it together. So as we understand the principles of ancient Babylon, it helps us to understand the principles of mystic Babylon. Our next reference is in Revelation 16 and verse 19. And here it says, And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Here Babylon is said to be the great city. And in her cup she will receive the wine of the fierceness of God's wrath. In the place of the wine that she has been giving out to the world, that the world in modern times has been made mad by, God's going to replace that one day with his wrath. Now, in Revelation 17. We could turn to Revelation 17. Verse 1. And there came one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come thither, I will shew unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. Now remember, there's going to be seeing a judgment about a great whore that sits upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Have we read about wine before? This is the doctrines, the teachings. In verses 3 and 4 now. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman set upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. But this woman has a name. And in verse 5 we get her name. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. This woman that we read about here is called Mystery Babylon the Great. Now, it's interesting because he says that if you go back to verse 1, he says, Come thither, I will shew unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. Perhaps in vision, as John is seeing this panorama, he has seen this whore, but the angel hasn't explained it yet. But he says, there's this whore, and I'm going to explain it to you now. I'm going to give you some understanding about it. And so here she is introduced. And notice these points. Notice these points about this harlot. One is, she sits upon many waters. We know that the Bible defines these waters as people, multitudes, nations, and tongues. It says that she has committed fornication with the kings of the earth. She has made the inhabitants of the earth drunk with the wine of her fornication. She sits upon a scarlet-colored beast. She's decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. She has a golden cup of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. Her name is Mystery Babylon the Great. And she is a mother. She is a mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now let's go to Revelation 18, because we're not done reading about Babylon. And we're going to put all this together here in just a little bit. We're getting there. Revelation chapter 18. I'll start reading verses 1 and 2. And after these things, I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Notice here again, just like in Isaiah 21:9, just like in Revelation 14:8, Babylon is fallen, but simply not just fallen, it is fallen as fallen. And here specifically it's mentioned as Babylon the Great too. Because remember, in Revelation 17, this harlot was defined as Babylon the Great. And it says that she is the habitation of devils. She is the living place of devils, the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean, hateful bird. Now, Paul may be a little bit redundant in what he's saying there, using some different expressions so that we understand the depth of the depravity of this creature, this beast, this woman, this church, if you please. But he wants us to be clear that we know what we are involved in. Now, I don't know about you, friends, but I have a house I live in. You probably have some place you live. But if I knew there were demons in that house, and I knew I couldn't get those demons out of that house, I wouldn't be living there. I wouldn't be going in that house. Would you? If you knew there were demons in your house, and for whatever reason you knew you couldn't get them out, would you go stay there? Verse 3. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. We see here that the whole world's involved with this process, and it's into the mercantile area of their lives. Verses 4 and 5 now, if you please. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, what is this voice says? Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Remember Jeremiah? Come out of her, my people. And if you don't come out of her, the implication is that you will receive of her plagues. The implication is that you will be lost with her, because she's going to be lost. She's going to meet the judgment of God someday. Again, just to recap some of these points. Babylon is again said to be fallen, fallen. Said twice for emphasis and surety that she is fallen. She is the home of devils, foul spirits, and every unclean and hateful bird. All nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. The merchants of the earth are rich through her sensual luxury. Because in the King James Version, where it speaks about her delicacies, that's what it means. Sensual luxuries. And God calls his people to come out so that they will not receive of the plagues, and her sins have reached unto heaven. Now there's two more references. Revelation 18 and verses 9 and 10. Our reference is in verse 10, but we're reading verse 9 just to get a little of the backup. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her, and shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. In other words, when her judgment comes, she goes down quickly. And all the world just mourning. They hate this destruction of Babylon. But then in Revelation chapter 18, verse 21, and a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence shalt thou great city, Babylon, be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. God's going to do a sure work with Babylon, and it will never be resurrected, never come back up. When God brings an end to Babylon, it is gone forever. Now these are our texts. But what do they mean? Who is Babylon? Who is this Babylon mentioned in Revelation 14:8? and what causes her to fall? What will be her judgment? And how can we come out of Babylon? Before the giving of the second angel's message in Revelation 14:8, there is a message given in Revelation 14:6 and 7. And we will look at this in more detail later, but for now, let us just suffice to understand or to comprehend that if we do not have an appreciation and an understanding of the first angel's message, it would be very hard to have an understanding of what the second angel's message is truly about. According to the first angel's message, we are living today in the hour of God's judgment, in the antitypical day of atonement. According to the prophecy of Daniel 8:14, there would be a period of 2,300 days that would bring us down to the final events of the judgment. And we know that we are living in that time today. This day of atonement was the day of all the atonements. It was the atonement of atonements. It was the only feast that had a prohibition against work equal to that of the fourth commandment. There was a typical day of atonement, a real day of atonement that the Jews would keep each year. They would today call it Yom Kippur. But we realized that that was symbolic. It was a symbol of something that was going to happen in a reality. And that reality is happening actually right now, today. Sometimes people will ask me, and I've had a call this week, do you keep the feasts? Well, no. But yes, in a sense, because right now I believe I'm participating in the real antitypical Day of Atonement, which involves affliction of soul for the individual, doesn't it? This of all the feasts was to represent to the people the righteousness which comes from faith alone in Christ. All the works of Babylon are the works of man and not of God. And they run counter to God, and they run counter to the plans of God. Babylon has no faith in God. Babylon is rebellious. But God's going to have a people who are faithful, who have faith in Him, who believe His promises, and are obedient and loyal to Him. Sometimes people will make fun of you for wanting to obey God's commandments, friends. I don't think there's anything funny about being loyal to God. Putting the different pieces together here, from what we've been studying, we can come to some conclusions that aren't too hard. In Great Controversy on page 381.1, just to use this quotation because it sums it up so well. The term Babylon is derived from Babel and signifies confusion. It is employed in Scripture to designate the various forms of false or apostate religion. So Babylon as a generic, as a big whole, it's every form of false and apostate religion. And there are people who claim to have no religion, but they have religion. Everybody has some kind of religion. People who are atheists, their religion is atheism, friends. It's a religion of itself. And so again, in the most broad sense, Babylon is used to represent every false religious system. But we also find that Babylon can have a restricted sense. Women in biblical prophecy represent churches. And the woman in Revelation 12 represents God's pure church, His true church. But in Revelation 17 we have this woman, and she represents the Roman papal church. While claiming to be the gate to God, it is the most confused religious system in the world. And it is in rebellion against God, against His commandments, openly changing His commandments, making no apologies for changing His commandments. And a church that depends upon the works of men for salvation instead of the work of God for salvation. In the Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4, page 233 in paragraph 1, we read this. In Revelation 17, Babylon is represented as a woman, a figure which is used in the Scripture as a symbol of a church. A virtuous woman represents a pure church, a vile woman an apostate church. Babylon is said to be a harlot and the prophet beheld her drunken with the blood of saints and martyrs. The Babylon thus describes represents Rome, that apostate church which has so cruelly persecuted the followers of Christ. And if you remember back to what we read in 1 Peter 5, Peter was speaking about the church at Babylon. It was the church at Rome, which would later grow to become this monster of the Catholic Church. And in fact, even in Paul's day, writing to the church at Thessalonica, he said, the mystery of iniquity, what? Doth already work. But sadly, the story doesn't end here. Because this harlot has daughters. She has offspring who take up her trade, her profession. She has daughters. Volume 4, page 233, continuing in paragraph 1. Same paragraph, I'm just splitting it into another slide so that you can see it easier. But Babylon the harlot is the mother of daughters who follow her example of corruption. Thus are represented those churches that cling to the doctrines and traditions of Rome and follow her worldly practices, and whose fall is announced in the second angel's message. Where was the second angel's message found? Revelation 14, verse 8. So here we see that these daughters, they have the same teachings, the doctrines, the traditions. They follow the worldly practices. You see, when a harlot has a child, it takes the name of the mother. There's no father around. It has to take the name of the mother. And the mother's name is Babylon. And so the daughter's name is also Babylon. They're just not simply designated Babylon the Great, but they are a part of Babylon. A very similar statement, but with just a little nuance of difference in Great Controversy, page 382.3. Babylon is said to be the mother of harlots. By her daughters must be symbolized churches that cling to her doctrines and traditions. And now here's something a little different. And follow her example of sacrificing the truth and approval of God in order to form an unlawful alliance with the world. In other words, friends, we will give up our loyalty to God so that we can have an alliance with the world. These daughters, they also, like their mother, lack faith. These daughters, like their mother, are in rebellion against God. Now, in what commandments are almost all professed Christians, whether they are Catholic or Protestant, in violation? At least the first and the fourth commandment. And I'm going to tell you the seventh commandment is coming in fast as well. In the first angel's message, in Revelation 14, we are called to worship the true God and to worship Him as Creator. Concerning the call to come out of Babylon in Revelation 14:8, we read this, Spirit of Prophecy, continuing in page 232, paragraph 2. But the message announcing the fall of Babylon must apply to some religious body that was once pure and has become corrupt because it's fallen. It cannot be the Romish church, which is here meant, for that church has been in a fallen condition for many centuries. But how appropriate the figure as applied to the Protestant churches, all professing to derive their doctrines from the Bible, yet divided into almost innumerable sects. They're into confusion, and they are into disobedience to God's commandments, especially the first commandment and the fourth commandment, and more, they're becoming disobedient to the seventh commandment as well. I'll talk about that later. In Jeremiah, he said, I would have healed Babylon. He said, I would have healed Babylon if she'd let me. God would have healed these apostate Protestant churches if they had submitted to Him in 1844. But instead they rebelled. They turned against the message of the first angel. And their lack of faith and their rebellion disqualified them to do God's work. In Revelation 17, 1 through 6, we find that God's judgment falls upon mystic Babylon because she has made these nations drunk with her wine. But today, friends, today, we can come out of Babylon. We are commanded to come out of Babylon. And this is something more, and please, if you don't get anything else, get this. This is something more than physically changing the church pew we sit in. We can physically come out of the Roman Catholic Church. I could be a papist at heart and leave the Catholic Church and even join the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But I can bring Babylon with me. I can still bring my lack of faith. I can still bring my disobedience. But friends, if we lack saving faith, if we are in our hearts rebellious against God, in fact, in any form of disobedience to any part of His revealed will, we are still in Babylon. We could be sitting right here today and be in Babylon. Don't forget that. Remember that. But as Billy Mays used to say, there's one more thing. I've mentioned some commandments. We think about the first commandment, the worship of the true God, understanding God, the truth about God. We oftentimes speak about the fourth commandment. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. And we know that this runs in antithesis to the first day and the worship on the first day of the week that the papacy has instituted, which is her brainchild, which all the former Protestant, now Protestant churches follow with her in. But the seventh commandment, friends, it not only prohibits idolatry, but all forms of sinful, sexual, deviant behavior. And today, if you are a part of or supporting of the transgender movement or the LGBTQ and however many next initials get on it, movement, you are in Babylon. You are in Babylon if you are a part of that or can support it. The Biden administration recently nominated Dr. Rachel, formerly Richard Levine, to be Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services. Dr. Levine is a pediatrician and a transgender woman. And under questioning recently on her confirmation hearings by Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, Levine refused to speak against hormone blockers and sex-changing surgery on minors, even without the consent of the parents. But you see, the current administration must be woke, and Levine is their representative. Think about this. The child asked me, "Can I have a cigarette?" What are you going to say? No, you're just 5 years old. You can't have a cigarette, right? What if the child says, "Well, can I have a beer?" What are you going to say? Nah, you can't have a beer. You're only 5 years old. You can't make that kind of a decision. What if the child says, "Can I drive a car?" Oh, no. You're 5. You can't drive a car. You couldn't be responsible enough to do that. What if the child says, "Can I have a gun?" Oh, big no. Big no. You're only 5. You can't have a gun. But what if the child says, "Can I take hormones and change my sex?" The answer is, sure. You know best. Think about the hypocrisy of this. Think about the evil of this. Young children whose minds are moldable, and you put them in an environment where they are taught that gender is malleable and you can just be whatever you want. And to think that people in high places, in the highest place of our country, can call this acceptable? Parents and a society that will not protect its own children have crossed a terrible line. God condemns this kind of thing in the utmost ways. In Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 10, he says, "There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that uses divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch." Beloved, if we continue to promote the sacrifice of children on the altar of government-mandated sexual rebellion, can we expect to receive anything less than the plagues of God that He's reserved for Babylon? Oh yes, there's a lot of ways to be in Babylon, to be in rebellion against God. Now, if you think I'm failing to show love, you're wrong. Love, friends, points out the sin. It does not allow people to wallow in it and to be lost. But Brother Allen, don't these people have civil rights? Civil rights to their own lifestyle? Well, actually, friends, God does not condone the civil powers to grant this freedom. And this is where I will differ with a lot of the probably other conservatives out there speaking on these issues. They'll say, well, everyone has a civil right to do what they want, just as long as it doesn't bother other people. Well, the fact is, friends, it does bother other people. The fact is, it can't be contained like an encapsulated cancer to itself. It spreads its tentacles anywhere it can find them. God alone receives worship from us. And our worship to God is directed on the first table of the Decalogue, right? Those first 4 commandments. But God has allowed the civil authorities to enforce the second table dealing with human-to-human relationships. And as best I remember, the 7th commandment is on the second table of the Decalogue. Remember that the term civil, it means civil. It means you have to be civil. Homosexuality, this LGBTQ whatever, all this kind of experience is condemned in the Bible and is shown to be evil. And it is shown, in fact, it is not civil. The experience recorded in Genesis 19 of the crowd at Sodom when Lot tried to protect 2 visiting angels shows that. The example of the Sodomites at Gibeah, as recorded in Judges 19, reveal the uncivil nature of this sin and evil. And so I'd like to say that today, that there is a lot to this coming out of Babylon. God has people in Babylon, and He calls them to come out of sin, to come out of rebellion, to come out of their lack of faith. Rebellion against God is a terrible thing. It is a terrible thing. There is a rebellion today. There is a rebellion today against the prescribed forms of worship that God has given to His people. We see, instead of solemn, reverent worship services, we see rock and roll music and drums and electric guitars and all kinds of things on the platforms. We see preachers who don't even know what a suit is. They come out in an old shirt and blue jeans anymore. Well, this is the way that we're taught to do this anymore because the young people like it, And instead of serving God, we're serving man. And that's Babylon. And that's Babylon. And it's a confusion. God has ordained, not because intrinsically men are better than women, but He has ordained the men to be the preachers and the great leaders of His church. But it is rebellion when we begin to ordain women to the gospel ministries, friends. That is a part of Babylon. God has given godly women good talents and places in His church. But this just isn't one of them. God calls His people to come out of unbelief and to trust in Him, to trust in His ways, and to do His word. Mystical Babylon is greater than anything ever imagined by those who held power in ancient Babylon. But the intention is still the same, to stand against God and to end His purpose for human life. Friends, God calls you to come out. Jesus says in Mark 11:22, have faith in God. Jesus says, have faith. Have faith in God. We need to have faith. And friends, Jesus is the source of our faith. In Hebrews 12:2, it says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus Christ is the author and finisher of our faith. And if we could just go through a short story in closing. In Mark chapter 9, we read here a story about when Jesus came down from the Mount of Transfiguration. And there was a man there who had a son who was possessed. And the disciples that had been left behind, they tried to cast this demon out, and they didn't have any luck, it seems like, and success. Starting in verse 17, and one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. He answereth him and saith, O faithless generation. Oh, what kind of generation? Faithless. How long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. And they brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tare him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. Continuing in verse 21. And he asked his father, How long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, Of a child. And oftentimes it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus saith unto him, If thou canst what? Believe. All things are possible to him that believeth. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. And the word unbelief is apista. It's simply a negative form of the word for faith. He says, I believe, I pistuo, I have faith, but help my unbelief. Give me more faith. I need this. And of course, Jesus called the foul spirit to come out of the young man. The father, he wanted and he needed faith. And Jesus helped him. And he will help us when we cry out to him. He will empower us to do his will and obey his commandments so that we can be the kind of people that are spoken of in the book of Revelation as being the end time people, who according to Revelation 14 and verse 12 can be said of them, here's the patience of the saints. Here are they that profess the commandments of God, claim the commandments of God, want to do the commandments of God. Here are the people who want. They actually keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Notice that the remnant had the opposite of the two great characteristics of those in Babylon. In the place of the lack of faith, they had the faith of Jesus. In the place of disobedience, they keep the commandments of God. Friends, you can be a part of that people who have coveted to keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. I want to encourage you to come to Jesus today just as you are. You cannot cleanse yourself. You cannot come out of Babylon by yourself. You cannot do anything by yourself. But by the grace of God, you can turn to Jesus, and he will help you to be willing, to be made willing, and his grace will enable you to do what is right. In Jude 24, Jude chapter 1, verse 24 just has one chapter. It says, Now unto him that is able to keep you from falling, and to present you how? Faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy. Friends, this world is dark today. It's been dark a long time, and it's getting darker. It's getting darker. But God wants you to be that remnant people. He wants you to be a part of that people that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. He wants you to be a part of a people that Peter calls a royal generation. He says, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of what? Darkness into his marvelous light. He has called you, friends, out of darkness. He's called you out of Babylon into his light, into his new Jerusalem. That will be your home someday. I want to be a part of that people, don't you? Amen. But God says you need to understand Babylon. You need to come out of it. We're going to be talking more about it in the next sermon or two that I have. So just get the seatbelt on. We're not done. But I want you to understand, friends, Babylon is big. It's much bigger than we commonly think of it. And God wants us to come all the way out of Babylon. And may he bless each one of you lots and lots and lots to do that.